Bibles along with me to the Gospel according to Luke chapter 23 is where we're presently studying. Our time of communion last week was something I'll always hold in my heart. Times like that, time spent together, so meaningful to me. My mind may fail. No, my mind will fail. But my heart remains full. Times together. And here, going through the Gospel of Luke, we've been seeing our Jesus, the kindest, most gentle man that ever lived, the best of what humanity could possibly be, going through the worst of what humanity can do. The brutality, the cruelty, the horrid things that are happening here in Luke chapter 23. And we've been following him along. And as you see what's happening to him, it's really easy to get angry. If I try to put myself on the sidelines, if I try and see myself as one of those who is witnessing what's happening, if I in my life see anything even close to that, where good people get treated just horribly, it's so easy to want to get all fired up and angry, so easy to want to search out for someone to blame, but it's so important to notice that Jesus doesn't do that. He's not fired up, he's not angry, he's not looking for anyone to blame. He says, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And if we're going to follow Jesus, we better follow him closely, like Peter didn't do for a while. If we're going to follow him, let's really be followers and do as he did. And so no anger, it was the joy that was set before him. He went along his course. And it says there in verse 27, Luke 23, verse 27, that there were following him a great multitude of the people. Now, based upon what we read a few weeks ago in the earlier verses 13 through 25, it would be really easy looking at that opinion poll to see a whole different sort of people. And it was. We saw there that the people all together, they were insistent with their voices, their demand, and finally Pilate delivered Jesus over to their will. That was a group of people. That was a certain percentage of people. And a lot of times when you hear of that, when you hear the crowds, the multitudes are that way, you think everyone's that way. That's just the way it is. But here's another angle. Here's another truth that's also to be told. It's there in verse 27. There was also following him a great multitude of the people. And these people, rather than crying out, let him be crucified, some of them are curious, no doubt. Some of them are just wondering what's going to happen. But many are very sympathetic. And specifically, Luke tells us that of the people this multitude was made up, and of the women, these women were specifically mourning and lamenting. They were mourning and they were weeping over what was happening to Jesus. And if you can imagine that, if you can see in your mind's eye these women with their compassionate hearts just watching Jesus going down the course of this road, and they're wailing and they're grieved, they're smitten. Their hearts are bursting, but their hands are tied because there's nothing they can do. This is not a crowd that's going to start a revolt. Remember, the religious leaders were afraid of that. But these women, as sympathetic as they were toward him and what was going on, here they are doing what must have seemed to them like next to nothing. What else can I do? I can weep, I can cry, I can mourn, I can lament. I wish I could do so much more. Maybe some of them were angry. But what can I do? And so they wept on the sidelines. But the important thing to see today here in Luke's gospel is, though they were on the sidelines, they certainly weren't sidelined. What they did mattered. It always matters. When you want to do what you can do and it seems like, man, I can't do much, do what you can do. You might find it's a whole lot more than you think. Here's these women on the sideline, and they're weeping, and Luke alone, and I've said that a lot here going through the Gospel of Luke. Luke alone says things the other Gospel writers don't tell us. Each has its place. Each has its purpose. But Luke has been called, by some, the Gospel of womanhood. And for good reason. Luke's Gospel brings out things that the other Gospels just don't focus on. Remember back in chapter 1, even if you totally forget, I'll tell you. Back in chapter 1, the whole book begins with a barren woman. It begins with a woman who longs to have a family. She's past that age where she can have a family. And so she weeps and she cries and she turns her tears to prayers, just like other women in the Old Testament did. The wife of Abraham, Sarah, Hannah, the mother of Samuel the prophet. These barren women would long for a family. And they would weep toward God, and they'd turn their tears into prayers, and they would find that God hears, that God grants, that God gives them a family. And so the beginning of the Gospel of Luke is just that, Elizabeth, this woman. And out of her tears comes forth John the Baptist, the one who baptizes so many in water, was born out of those waters of tears, out of the weeping of his mother, crying that she might have this family. And so that's how the gospel begins. But here is how the course of Jesus ends, at least his earthly course, as far as his sufferings. It's with this. It's with these women who are mourning and weeping and lamenting him. And Jesus turned to them and he said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren. Blessed are those women whose wombs have never borne a child, and those breasts that have never nursed a babe.'" He says, times are changing. And there's worse things than not ever having had a family, as Elizabeth or Sarah or Hannah may have prayed. Worse than, I'm barren and I'll have no family. Worse than that is to have a family and watch them utterly consumed, burnt to bits in a holocaust of anger and hatred. And that's what's coming. And Jesus knew that. And he said, "Ladies, gals, sisters, daughters of Jerusalem, weep for this." And I don't think that he's directing them to a blind end, something that's like, "Oh yeah, go ahead and cry, for as good as that is." I don't think so at all. He says, weep along this line, weep according to this course, and God will hear. And your prayers will be formed from these tears. And your tears will help. And God will help. Now, if you're anything like me, you have my sympathies. You might be a little cynical, and you might find at times that it seems like nothing helps, like certain things are just going to be, it is what it is, and that's it. But here in the Gospel of Luke, I'm so thankful for the perspectives, especially of people like this along the sidelines, someone who maybe feels like, my heart's bursting, but my hand's tied, what can I do? There's much that you can do, and the women in Luke's Gospel really do a lot. It's taken centuries for humanity to realize the other half of who we are. God created him male and female. And the beauty and the glory and the great worth of women who've so often been sidelined in terms of the political power or the military power or whatever else that muscles and dominance can do for you. But here in Luke's Gospel, he alone tells us, again, beginning with the first chapters of Elizabeth and Mary. We know of Mary elsewhere, but no stories elsewhere like what we have here in Luke. Elizabeth and Mary, and go back in your mind to those times, these two women coming together, related in so many ways, and just praising God and marveling over these miraculous births, these new families that would come forth from them. Luke alone tells us those stories. And it's Luke alone that tells us of Jesus being brought like a little baby into the temple there in Jerusalem. And there's an old woman, and I don't know if she was barren. She seemed like she was all alone, but not alone. Day and night, she'd stay there around the temple. And she was just waiting for what? For who would save Jerusalem. She was looking for the redemption of Jerusalem. And when the baby Jesus was brought in, she says, "I've seen it. There's the salvation of Jerusalem. Here's how Jerusalem's going to be saved." And Luke alone tells us about that woman, a widow, who lost her only support, her only son. And when the funeral entourage is coming down, Jesus stops the thing and turns it around. He raises the son. That's our Jesus. That's who he is. It's no wonder that though, because of the times and the culture, Jesus had to give the message to men. All the apostles, they're all men. You have to give the message to men, but it seems like the women were more receptive to receive the message in many ways because they saw his heart. You know, women aren't perfect, I know. They're not perfect. But man, they're just as good as men in every way, and in some ways far more perceptive and far more able to pick up things. But how often they've not been historically respected or seen as such because they don't have the type of power that men might have. And so, yeah, it was necessary that the gospel go forth to men, but the funny thing is there's not a single woman in the gospels that says anything bad about Jesus. I'm not saying that there weren't bad women. You know they're out there. I'm just saying that feminism isn't something that just was born in recent centuries. In the heart and in the gospel of Christ, it was there from the beginning. And Luke's gospel especially brings that out. Luke alone tells us that story of a woman who came and she wept over the feet of Jesus, which was scandalous, and it was public. And the Pharisee was outraged, and Jesus rebuked him. That woman who wept over his feet, and Jesus received that. He accepted that. And you might remember, believe it or not, it's been a couple of years ago, but you might remember what we saw back in chapter 8, where it says that there was a traveling group that went with Jesus. And among that traveling group were women, which again was scandalous. A group traveling, camping, caravanning, not wives necessarily. There were wives, no doubt, but women who went along. And yet, far from being scandalous, it says something, Luke tells us that some of these women had been healed of evil spirits and sicknesses. Mary, who was called Magdalene, was one of them, from whom 7 demons had gone out. And Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who were contributing to the support of Jesus and all those other guys. These women were supporting these men out of their private means. Again, that's not the kind of thing in that culture, in that time, that you put on your placard, like, hey, the women support us. Nowadays, maybe we're waking up to some of these sort of things, but it's way back then, and Jesus accepted it, and Luke alone tells us these stories of how it was that they traveled about and how it was that they were supported. And Luke alone tells us that story of Mary and Martha. We don't find it elsewhere. I mean, they show up in other places, but that story where both of these women so much wanted to do so much for Jesus, and Martha gets all ticked off and angry, because people do that. But Mary chose the better part. And then finally, there's a story that we saw recently that Luke alone tells us, where there was a woman who had been bent over double. Some kind of evil thing had happened. She was bent over double for 18 long years. That's how Jesus described it. 18 long years. And he wouldn't accept it a second longer. Even though it was a Sabbath, and even though he's going to get more hatred and flack thrown at him because he's not going to wait a second longer, I can heal her now. And I'm going to heal her now. And that woman was made upright. And all of that in the Gospel of Luke. And now this that Luke alone tells us about as he's walking along. And if there were a gospel, if this were something of my choosing to find, which gospel will we be in right here in the year 2019, I would say, let's pick the Gospel of Luke. Particularly because, this is the 100-year celebration. Most of you know this. Probably all of you know this. But I'll just remind you, it's a 100-year celebration of the 19th Amendment allowing women to vote. It's only been 100 years. And we allowed women to vote. Oh, mighty nice of us, isn't it? Talk about trying to function with half your brain tied behind your back. Finally, you pull out the other half of humanity and you say, we need to work together. We need to share what each of us has and contributes one to another. But it hadn't been that long. And yet Luke's gospel from way back says the Spirit of God is so unlike how we can behave. And in Christ there's neither male nor female, the scriptures say. And so if we're going to celebrate, since we should celebrate 100 years later, how much better to be in the gospel according to Luke. But here, this little vignette, this little picture we're looking at this morning, it points out that though women didn't have the vote, they've always had a voice, they've always been able to do what they can do, and they've always had a profound influence. Thank God that it can be more. But a profound influence, and what these women were doing was not a waste, and it didn't go unnoticed. And Jesus gives them guidance. As a good shepherd, as one who would direct them, he gives them guidance in their weeping. You know, it's funny. You can read the same Bible, lots of folks do it, and they come away with such totally different ideas about who Jesus is and how it is. And it's so much in terms of who you are, the reader, and what kind of tone you have in your own heart and your own head and the way you read it. And some would see Jesus as stopping these women. Stop weeping for me. Weep for yourselves. Some people see Jesus as vindictive, as though forget what he says a few verses later about Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They see the second coming as Jesus coming back with a vengeance because of what you've done. And weep for yourselves, women, the way we might say to somebody that's like, you cry because you're going to get it. But that's not the heart of our Lord Jesus. We know that. And if you can imagine for a moment, just try to imagine how exhausted he was at that point as he trotted along that Via Dolorosa. I mean, he couldn't even carry the cross. He was brutalized. He was physically and mentally exhausted, and yet the incredible thing of this picture is that he still had room somewhere in his heart and mind. He still had room for somebody else's sufferings, for somebody else's pain, to take notice and then to redirect them so that their pain wouldn't be pointless. Because he knew what he was doing. He knew where he was going. And so Jesus, as he's walking along, far from being just focused on his own pain and his own suffering, he hears these voices. Out of the corners of his eyes, though the blood and sweat in his own eyes, he still hears and he sees these women. And it says he turns. He stops the course he's on and he turns. And he tells them something. It says, turning to them, he said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me." Daughters of Jerusalem. There's a tenderness in that. There's a family aspect of who they are, and they belong to that city. These are not the Galilean women who followed him. These were the Jerusalem women who were so touched by who Jesus was and what his message was all about. And he says to them, stop weeping for me. Stop weeping for me, but start weeping here. He says, turn off this tap and then channel your tears in this direction, because here's where they won't be wasted. Here's where they'll be more useful. He's not rebuking them, he's redirecting them. For me, I don't need it. Don't weep for me. But here's a waterway. Here's the canal. Here's the channel your tears can go down where it may help. Here's where the parched ground is. Here's where the fields are that are about to burn like you would not believe. Let the water go that way, because it's not needed for me. He first of all turns off the tap toward him. Because, he's not angry. He's not burning inside. He's not about to blow when I get to Calvary. For the joy set before him, he endures the cross. He despises the shame. His light never goes out. He says, I don't need those tears. I'm well watered. As he'll say in a moment, I'm the green tree. I'm bearing fruit even now. Don't weep for me. Don't waste your tears here. It's not necessary. But having turned off the tap toward himself, he opens the valve, just like out in the fields irrigating or wherever you take the waters. It's not necessary in this field. Let's open the valve and turn the tears in this direction. Here's the parched ground. And he says, daughters of Jerusalem, it needs to be for the families of Jerusalem. It needs to be for yourself and for your kids and for your future. Here in this place, here in this city. He says, here's where your tears may indeed be helpful. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. And they'll begin to say, as the Old Testament prophets said in Hosea, they will then say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills cover us. Our greatest hope is just to die and be covered and let our shame and our pain be gone. They'll begin to say such things, for he says, if they do what they're doing, if they do these things in the green tree, what will happen in the dry? What will happen when the branches are brittle and dry and when the tree is far from being green? And I don't know how many got it when he said it. I don't know how much I've ever gotten it till I've really slowed down and looked at it this week. But I think I get it now. Jesus is the green tree. What they do, who does? Pick your blame. We've been doing that. The Romans, what these cruel people do, the religious people, these people with all their politics and religion and all their hatred and all their anger and all their, we're going to get even with somebody else and we're going to, all the ones, even the folks that are saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, waving their political palm branches, which was the symbol of nationalist Israel, and thinking that these are the things that make for peace, just days before. All of those people, it all comes down to this. And he says, if this happens to the green tree, when things get more brittle, when things get more dry, when the drought goes on a little longer, if there's no watering, if there's no tears shed in the right place, how much worse and how quickly it's going to come. And so Jesus, of course, he's always the green tree, isn't he? He was bearing fruit right up to the point they hung him on the cross. And even that dead wood that was turned into a cross, even that dead wood had fruit coming forth from it because Jesus was there. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness. We'll look at it, those sayings of Jesus from the cross, and as he approaches the cross, he bore fruit right up into the end. He's the forever green tree. And you can cut a green tree down, but you can't burn it. You can knock it down, but try to burn it and you'll find no, it's still too full of moisture, still too full of sap. It's green. You can't burn it. And Jesus wasn't burning inside as he walked toward the cross, and he wasn't going to get worked up in somebody else's burning anger, and he himself had no angst toward those who did this to him. He was the green tree all along. And though he was being cut off, he's coming back. Again, the green tree. How often that's happened? Maybe a tree you didn't want. Ha! It's gone. Oh no, it's back. All these shoots coming up because the roots are still there. And in the far greater way, Jesus, he's the green tree. He's forever the green tree. The best we can do with our lives is be grafted into him. To be the branches grafted into the green tree and forever bearing fruit. He says, don't weep for me. I don't need that. That's not where the tears should be shed. I'm treading the course of total victory. He says, but there's dry wood. And the dry wood is all around you here in Jerusalem. The dry wood is everywhere, and it's going to get worse. And it did get worse every year that followed. The things that were incipient, the things that were happening here, it got worse and worse and worse. And these daughters of Jerusalem, these mothers of Jerusalem, are going to need to water that land. And it won't be a waste. All their tears, if they would turn them that way, it wouldn't be a waste. Now, reading back in history, you may know it well. I'll just remind you of what I think all of you know a little bit. Reading back in history, you might feel like, well, it would be a waste. Because you know what? A Holocaust was coming. I'm not talking about the Nazi ones centuries later. I'm talking about the one that happened beginning in 66 AD and finally following through to the destruction of the temple as Jesus prophesied. And man, within a generation, it was horrid. And you look at what happened. Sometimes if you look at history, at least I do, I'd love to study history. And sometimes you look back and you say, it was inevitable. No one was going to stop it. There's this course, there's this confluence, there's these things coming together, and bam, it's going to happen. And you feel like, what's the use of praying? What's the use of... And you know, those of us who look back at history and kind of feel like it's all, what's going to happen is going to happen, we need to realize that you don't live backwards. I hope you don't. You live looking forward, and we need to have hope. And even though that whole city was going to burn, because there were a lot of firebrands and a lot of political anger and a lot of angst and a lot of stuff even though all of that was going to happen, the prayers to let it not happen were not pointless. The tears to maybe keep it from happening, maybe it watered it, and maybe another year, another decade, who knows? And yes, certain things like death itself. You know, you're all going to die. Let me tell you something right now. You're all going to die. So why don't you just do it now and get it over with? Next time you get sick, don't take any medicine. You're going to die anyway, so don't, why be happy because the doctor helped you get better and you're going to live 20 more years? It's just 20 years, big deal. Don't take the medicine. Die. Silly, huh? Crazy. It's the same thing to think that my prayers are pointless, because it's going to happen anyway. My tears are pointless. It's going to happen anyway. No, some things are a crying shame, and it's a shame that we don't cry more. Pray and weep. And when you see the drought and the barren dryness, realize that God also sees that you weep and that you pray. And it may help a whole lot more than you know. And yeah, there was a Jewish revolt. And yeah, it was horrid. Over 1 million Jews killed. And many of them at the hands of one another. It was horrid. All the political factions, all of the groups that fought against one another in the city while the Romans surrounded it. Yeah, 500 people a day crucified outside the gates of Jerusalem by Titus and his soldiers, till they couldn't find any more wood to crucify any more people. Try and get these people to come out. 500 a day they would crucify in front of them. The stories go on and on and on. It was horrid. And if you get more deep into the study of it, you'll find it's even more horrid. What they were doing in the city to one another, and why they were doing what they were doing. And all of this Jesus knew. And is it inevitable? I don't know. But it's worth weeping over. And he said to the daughters of Jerusalem, if this is what happens, if this is what all this comes together to do to a green tree, wow. There's a need for water. There's a need for tears. Personally, I refuse fatalism. Whether it's scientific determinism or some sort of religious fatalistic doctrine that says, well, it's going to be what it's going to be. I refuse it because I'd be depressed if I didn't think my life mattered and my prayers matter and my choices matter. So I'm not going to say it's inevitable, it's got to happen. I'm going to have hope. And I'll pray and I'll weep and I'll hope. And Jesus was simply directing these women to do as he had done. You remember. When everyone else is saying, Hosanna, Son of David, Jesus sobbed. He said, if you only knew this day what it is that will make for peace. But it's been hidden from you. You see, we hide it from ourselves. And so he directed them to weep where he weeps, and it's never a waste. I think we live in a time for tears. I think there's a place for it. I think whenever you find there's so much anger, so much dryness, so much anger being met by anger, so much inclination to fight fire with fire. Well, they did it to us, we're going to double dog do it to them. You know, you can stop a fire with a backfire. Of course you can. When the fire has no more fuel, it's out. But nothing's left. You double the fire. You can stop the fire, but you can only quench it with water. You can only really stop it with something of a totally different nature. You can only overcome evil with good, as we're told. And so, knowing that, and knowing this poor world has been scorched so many times over, politically, socially, And yeah, even physically, the parables, the pictures are everywhere. We've had drought times here in California and the terrible fires we've had, but they've happened in the past, and it's not like, well, it's going to happen, so nothing to do about it. Oh yeah, God help us to do something about it. There was a big burn, they call it, the big burn of 1910. Over 3 million acres burnt. It was massive. Wonderful, not wonderful, terrible, wonderful, I don't know. Intriguing story. PBS has a thing on it, Netflix or whatever. The big burn, massive, massive fire. The only thing that stopped it was when the heavens opened up finally. Ultimately, a lot of things were learned. A lot of people, a lot of what we've learned about forestry and the Forest Service all came out of that terrible, terrible calamity. And a lot of people stopped it from hitting places where it didn't have to hit because they fought in the right way. But ultimately, the only thing that stopped it was it rained. The sky is crying, tears from heaven. There's a picture in all of that. And in the second coming of Christ and the ultimate time when all the tears that have been put in the bottle that the psalmist speaks of, when all those tears come back round again, and when Jesus returns, every tear will be wiped away. But for now, based upon this little picture, Jesus doesn't want us to weep for him. There's no need. Nor is there any need to weep for anyone who is following him. If we are following Jesus closely, not following him with a vendetta, a grudge, or an anger, but following him as he walked. If we're walking in the path of love, patience, kindness, goodness, anyone walking in that course, whatever it is bad that may happen to them, it's sad, but you know what? They're more than conquerors. Anyone who's out doing things out of a heart of love, it may be sad to know that they've been martyred. It may be sad to know they've been misjudged. It may be sad to know that someone has done terrible things to them. But you know what? They are true heroes, and they are the ones who ought to just be like, hey, I'm victorious. Every act done in love is always going to win. So don't spend a lot of time weeping there. But everything done in anger, everything done because somebody got all fired up, and maybe you got fired up for Jesus. Jesus doesn't want us to weep for him, nor does he want us, and this may be news to you, not to you, because you guys keep coming back here. I don't know why you do, but I think for a lot of folks these days, it might be a novel concept that Jesus doesn't want us to get fired up for him. Where did we ever get that notion? Let's get fired up for Jesus. I understand Pentecost, that's another story. But you get fired up for the big game, right? You get fired up for the big battle. You get fired up for the big convention. You get fired up. You just get fired up. Like a bunch of orcs, just we're fired up for battle. You have to. If you're going to the big game, the big battle, beat your chest, go out there and hit those guys, because we're going out for the big battle, the big game. And tears are never helpful in battle. If your objective is to shoot the arrow straight, to fire the gun, it doesn't help to have tears in your eyes. There's no place for tears when your purpose is to fire. When you're on that kind of a battlefield, keep firing, keep firing, keep firing. Don't quit. And then finally we won, and we have peace, right? Did we ever have peace? We may stop the aggression over there, but there's a whole different, if we're going to fight the good fight, we're going to have to use the divinely powerful weapons. And they may seem as weak as tears at times, but those are not weak things. We need to realize that, look, this anger can't be met with anger. All we're going to have is just double anger. There needs to be something much more like Jesus expresses. Father, forgive them. Forgive us. We don't know what we're doing. Our Father, feed us, forgive us, deliver us, because we're all messed up. But you know what? We don't have to stay that way. The best of what humanity could be, again, it's a crying shame that we're not crying more and shamed more of what humanity can act like. But Jesus is not ashamed to call us brethren. And oh, how I love him, how I admire him. And when I see that he got the short end of the stick, injustice, cruelty, barbarity, I'm not going to weep for him because he won. He was totally victorious. I'm going to say, yes, I want to be like him. He really, really won. But do weep for those who think that the victory, that peace can be found some other way. Weep where he wept over that city. So excited. Hosanna, save now. If you knew the things that make for peace. We do. He's told us, shouldn't we? Blessed are the peacemakers. It's not always easy. And you may get totally trashed by folks, but don't get angry. Don't try to get even. Don't get all fired up. Fact is the Lord and his love will win. And even your tears turned to prayers will help far more than you know. If you weep in the right way at the right time, even that is not weakness. But a lot of what we call strength, a lot of we call being brave is, oh gosh, Bruce, just be quiet. Okay, you guys got the idea. You know, when you see things getting dry, when you see things getting brittle, when you see things, watch out. There's a big burn coming. Don't be a firebrand. Be a peacemaker. Jesus will tell you how. And if all you can do is weep, you know what? Thank you. We need more people to just cry and pray. And our Father will help us. So let's sing a song.